Hello everyone, welcome to CS Netflix. In this video we shall learn about the transaction states in DBMS, which means what are the states a transaction can have while the transaction is in execution. Okay, but before that, if you haven't subscribed to CS Netflix yet, do subscribe to get the updates of upcoming videos in which we shall discuss MCQs and PYQs on the concepts which we will learn one by one. So stay tuned. Now let's get started. Before getting started, as we know, in the previous video we had discussed about the definition of transaction. Yes, so what was a transaction? A transaction T1, if there is a transaction T1, a transaction T1 will have a few operations which it has to perform, which includes read-write operations, yes, and also some mathematical operations which we had to perform, and we saw this in the previous video. So now, as we know, there are several operations for a transaction to happen. I'd like to discuss two more important operations which a transaction should have if at all there are concurrent transactions which we are operating on. So here the two important operations which include in a transaction are commit and rollback. So here, what is the meaning of commit is that whatever operations we have performed so far, we would like to save those operations permanently. So that is why we use your commit operation. And then rollback operation is used to undo the work done. So consider here, after committing, again what I am doing is I am going to read A and then I am going to deduct another ₹50 from A. So now, before writing back to A or before committing, my transaction gets failed because of some server error. Okay. Now what happens is, now this has to roll back. These two operations have to get rolled back. So till where should it get rolled back? It should get rolled back up to the previous commit operation. So it will look as if though these two operations weren't performed at all. So that is the importance of rollback and commit operations. So these two are the important operations which a transaction should have to avoid certain concurrent issues in transactions. So now let's move on. So here, as you can see this diagram here, this table here, I have explained it with one more example. There is a transaction T1 initially, and we have seen this example earlier, but we'll see how a transaction, if the transaction gets failed, how it should roll back or what are the operations it should perform. So here T1 is a transaction. Again, A has 200, B has 100, and A has to send 50 to B. The same transaction we have seen earlier, but here what happens is the transaction starts, it reads the value from A, it deducts the amount from A, but after deducting the amount, right after that, before writing back the balance to A, what happens? There is a failure that has occurred here. So now in this particular case, what we have to do, we have not committed yet, so we have to roll back. So we have to use the operation roll back in order to go back to the initial stage of the transaction. So that is the example which we have taken here. So let's move on to another example here. In this example also, as we can see here, there are three data items, and there is one transaction which has to happen. That is, A has to send ₹50 to B. Okay. A has to send ₹50 to B, and B has to send ₹50 to C after that. So as we can see, we are reading A, deducting it from A, writing A. So till here our operations are committed, which means till here the operations are permanently done, and then the changes which have been done through these operations are permanent. Next, we are reading from B, we are adding those ₹50 to B's account, and then again we are writing back to B, which means now here also commit operation has been done, which means the changes are made during these operations are final and permanent. Now as we can see, again from B ₹50 are being deducted, and our aim was to put it into C's account, but as you can see ₹50 have been deducted, but here after reading C, our transaction is prone to some error and it has got failed. So what we are supposed to do in this particular thing is that we have to roll back to your previous commit operation. So where is our previous commit? Here is our previous commit, wherein this operation will be undone. So only 50 rupees will be added from A to B. The deduction operation which was performed will not be performed, which means it has got rollback to previous commit operation. So I hope commit and rollback is being now clear. Next, now we will move on to what are transaction states. So now initially what we can see here is a diagram which shows our transaction can have 5 states. So what are the 5 states? Active, partially committed, committed, failed and abort. So these are the 5 states in which our transaction can be. Initially when the transaction starts, it is said to be in the active state. Partially committed. So this partially committed state will be after active state, wherein our transaction has completed all the operations but it has not been committed yet. So we saw the commit operation before coming on to this slide, right? So before committing, whatever operations we have performed, if we are not committed and if we have done only those operations, that set of operations will be partially committed operations. Next, committed. As we saw, what is commit? Which means we are permanently making those changes to that particular data item. So after committing, those changes are permanent and those cannot be undone. Now after partially committed, just after partially committed, which means before, see, we'll read A and we are performing some operation on A, that is we are deducting 50 rupees from A. But before we are writing back to A, our transaction gets failed. So there, that is called as a partially committed state. So when the transaction gets failed here from the partially committed state, it will come to your failed state and then it can either roll back or it can abort. Yes, so it can roll back to previous commit or it can abort the particular transaction itself so that it can restart again. So let us see what is the theory which comes along with these transaction states. So the first state we saw was the active state. Yes, the active state is the first state of every transaction. In this state, the transaction is being executed. Obviously, it will start the transaction here. Yes, for example, insertion or deletion or updating a record is done here, but all the records are still not saved to the database. Initially, we are just trying to perform the read-write operation. So that is your active state. Next, we saw what is partially committed state. In the partially committed state, a transaction executes its final operation, but the data is still not saved, which means we have not done the operation commit. We have not committed the operations which we have done earlier. So all the operations are being performed, but they have not saved permanently into the database. So that is your partially committed state. Next is your committed state of a transaction. A transaction is said to be in a committed state if it executes all its operations successfully. Yes, that means all the changes are going to be permanently saved into the database. So in this state, all the effects are now permanently saved onto the database system. We have seen this and this is a theory that comes with this transaction state. Next, failed state. If any of the checks made by the database recovery system fails, then the transaction is said to be in the failed state, which means if any of the operation is failing to perform, and if the database finds out some error in the server or in any of the transaction operations, then that is declared as a failed state. Next, here the final state is the aborted state, which comes after the failed state. So if the transaction fails in the middle of the transaction, then before executing transaction, all the executed operations are rolled back to its consistent state. Here the word should be operations here, state. After aborting the transaction, the database recovery module will select one of the two operations. See, after the system is failed, that is after your transaction gets into your failed state, either it can restart the transaction or it can kill the transaction. If it kills the transaction, then it is not going to restart on its own. Manually, the operation or the transactions has to be started from the beginning by a user or the application programmer. So this was all about the transactions in DBMS, transaction states in DBMS. If you find my video helpful in understanding this concept, then do like my video and share it with your friends. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel to get the updates of my upcoming videos as earliest as possible. Thank you for watching.